Today on the show, I'm joined by Kiran Krishnan, a research microbiologist and one of the world's leading experts on the human microbiome and the gut-brain connection. As the scientific mind behind Just Thrive Health, Kiran has spent over 20 years uncovering how gut health affects everything from mental clarity and mood to immunity, inflammation, and burnout. Together, we explore the latest science on how your gut actually talks to your brain, what's sabotaging your mental resilience without you even realizing it, and why not all probiotics are created equal. In fact, most don't even survive your stomach acid. If you are ready for real research-backed solutions, not just wellness fluff, this episode is your guide. Kiran, welcome to the podcast. I'm very excited to talk about this because I've just released a book called Help in a Hurry, and I have a whole chapter where I talk about the fact that when we're angry, how all kinds of things happen, including the release of catecholamines, which increases blood pressure. And it also creates so much inflammation in the gut, messing up our microbiome. And that's just one thing. So we talk on this podcast so much about the psychoneurobiology of our humanity. So mind, brain, body connection, and how our mind is 99%, brain and body is the 1%. But you've got to have them working together. And what people don't often realize is that your memories are stored throughout the brain and the body and in the mind. And so therefore our gut's also storing memories. And our gut, as you, the expert, you're going to tell us more. I mean, our gut's got as many neurons as the spinal cord. So we definitely hear a lot about the gut and a lot about microbiome and all that kind of thing. And I'm so happy that we're going to unpack this together today. So welcome to the show. And I can't wait to dive in.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And these topics are so relevant. People are dealing with these issues every single day. And from what I see, the prevalence of the issues like anxiety, mood disorders, depression, sleeplessness, and then and you take that along with all the common digestive issues like bloating and gas and reflux and all that, they kind of all go hand in hand. Because when you look at the disruptions in the gut-brain axis that lead to mood disorders, they're the same kind of disruptions that also lead to bloating and gas and indigestion and constipation. So there's a reason why they kind of overlap quite a bit.
So interesting. A lot of the work I've done is on the non-conscious mind, NON, not unconscious, and that's the operating 24/7. It's the most intelligent part of us, and it always perceives everything a few milliseconds before we even consciously aware. But before we consciously aware, our gut's aware. So our non-conscious mind, the intelligent part of us, sends these messages as signals to our gut. So when we get things like IBS and bloating and gut issues and our gut brain, the biome gets messed up and our gut brain axis starts becoming affected, that really is a signal that we need to look at how we're managing our mind and how we are managing looking after our gut. So this is, as you say, such an important conversation. So the first thing I want to ask you is that when it comes to the body, the gut literally feels everything first. So it almost feels like the non-conscious mind is feeding this information to the gut first because there's a direct axis between the gut and the brain, and then it seems to hit the rest of the body. So can you talk a little bit about that, how the gut becomes literally the first responder when it comes to emotional stress?
Yeah, the number one, the microbes within the gut, of course, outnumber human cells, and the genetics within the gut far outnumber human genetics, right? So we've got about 22,000 functional genes, and we know we have over 2.5 million microbial genes in our system. So it's a 150 to 1 scale. So the
Wow.
metabolic capability of the gut, which includes biochemical sensing, sensing inputs that are coming into the body, and then taking action on those inputs, the microbes within the microbiome have far more capability on doing those things than we do, because they're so much more complex and so much more dynamic. And so when you think about the evolutionary adaptation that humans have gone through, humans have in being nomadic, in being omnivores, in roaming across many different types of regions and territories, eating a huge diversity of foods and other types of consumptions, whether it's roots and tubers that they're digging in the ground or things that they're plucking from the trees or animals that they're hunting and not only eating the meat, but they're eating the intestines and things like that.
Mhm.
We've built up this massive diversity of microbes, one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth
Wow.
within ourselves, right? And we
Amazing.
know, right, we're like any kind of ecosystem in the world, whether it's a rainforest or other areas, all the elements within the ecosystem are tightly connected and communicate with one another instantaneously based on inputs that are coming in. Because the human is actually a holobiote. That's actually a new definition of human in the literature, which means superorganism, right? We are a
Wow.
walking, talking rainforest. We are a massive collection of numerous ecosystems that have to work together to perpetuate the health of the whole. So the
Wow.
microbes have really designed this system where cellular communication happens instantaneously based on inputs coming in. So things we see, things we perceive, things we hear, things we put in our system, things that touch us, all of those things instantaneously gets communicated to the microbes from microbes in the region. And then the microbes tend to take action on it even before our own cells can do so. Right. And in some systems, our own cells wait for the microbes to respond to something. I'll give one quick example of that.
Yeah.
If you
Wow.
take our immune system, right,
Mhm.
our immune system has a very difficult job because our immune system is constantly looking for microbes that may make us sick, right? All the while being surrounded, basically a 200,000 to 1 ratio by microbes. So for every one immune cell we have roaming around looking for bad microbes, there are 200,000 commensal microbes in that region, right? So it's a really difficult task for that immune cell to figure out who is friend or foe. And you don't want
Mm.
the immune system overreacting. You don't want the immune system attacking every microbe it sees or every particle it sees, every food particle, and so on. And so there's this beautiful relationship between the commensal microbes. These are our bacteria that live within our ecosystem that we want there, where the microbes within the ecosystem will alert and signal to the immune system if there is something that they want it to pay attention to. So when you have a new virus that comes in, let's say into your lungs, and
Mhm.
you breathe it in and it's starting to infect you and it's starting to infect the lung cells, the first things to perceive that change in that system are the microbes in that region. And then the
Wow.
microbes in that region send signals to the immune system to recruit the immune system there. And then they provide the activation signal to tell the immune system that, yes, this is something I want you to attack, right? Or
Amazing.
right? Or you're exposed to something that the microbes want you to tolerate, like, airborne particles that are fine and harmless, pollen and things like that, right? That we shouldn't necessarily be reacting to, or food components. Then the microbes build up a threshold that says, hey, we need to regulate this immune response. Don't respond to this. So the microbes are taking the input first. And through all of their dynamic capabilities, they're instructing our cells how to behave. And that occurs in the gut brain axis with mood and stress perception. That occurs with depression. That occurs with sleep and virtually everything that affects us.
That's amazing. So they called consensual. What did you call them? The ones that pick it up first?
Commensal.
Commensal.
Yep.
Commensal. And so they pick it up first. Okay. So this is probably very new for most people to actually understand that, because you automatically think your immune system is responding. So to
Mhm.
actually this ecosystem of 50 million plus, did you say 50,
So for
150,
50 trillion, upwards of 50 trillion.
have upwards of 50 trillion system within our body, and that actually helps our body to function. So it's telling our
Yeah.
immune system, hey, pay attention to those issues going on around the lungs. You need to, there's a virus, there's something wrong there. You need to now respond. No, don't pay attention to this one yet. We need to build up immunity there. I mean, that's phenomenal. And
Yeah.
so if we don't have that's assuming that the microbiome is working like it should, which
Yes.
but so therefore the other side of the coin is what happens when it's not working like it should.
Yeah. Well, so and there's great evidence around this, right? So if you look at conditions like diabetes or
Yes.
obesity or other chronic conditions that are associated with a dysfunctional microbiome, those individuals are much more susceptible to basic infections because it takes their immune system so much longer to respond, given that their microbiome is not helping the immune system in the way it should. So a perfect
Wow.
example of that is you remember COVID, right? Everyone was very concerned about COVID and certain people getting much more sick than others. And COVID was a great study on how your system responds to something new and where your baseline response level is, right? So what became clear in the epidemiological studies around COVID, even now, is that if you took someone who was 45 years old and who
Hmm.
was diabetic, and you took someone who was 45 years old and non-diabetic, the diabetic 45-year-old had a tenfold increased risk of either dying from COVID or having a very serious response compared to the 45-year-old who did not have diabetes, right? So they're the same age. It had nothing to do with
Yeah.
age. It had to
Hmm.
do with what was going on with their microbiome. The diabetic has a very dysfunctional microbiome. They have high levels of pathogens. And those pathogens aren't going to help your immune system figure out how to fight something because they are also the quote unquote bad guys, right? The 45-year-old without diabetes, who is fairly healthy, has a microbiome that can immediately sense the presence of the new virus and then activate the immune system to go after it. Right. So the diabetic version, their microbiome is not helping the immune system. So the virus gets to do a lot more harm.
Hmm.
The healthy one, that it's very clear that the microbiome is helping the immune system and it's going to assist the immune system in a very timely fashion to go after this new virus. Right. So there's lots of data like that out there.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's incredible. So that just shows it's a different angle on this whole concept. And I think people maybe have heard something along these lines, but you explaining it so beautifully. I mean, it really is. If we don't have our microbiome, I think the key thing for me that you've said has really grabbed my attention is the fact that your your immune system is relying on the microbiome to tell it to advise it, literally
Yeah,
like an
exactly.
advisory board, a
It is.
massively complex advisory board. And if we any kind of chronic illness that we have, like diabetes or something, any lifestyle disease, has reduced that. So it's even more important to, if you've got any of those diagnosed conditions,
Mhm.
diabetes, blood pressure, high cholesterol, immediately your body is not functioning like it should. So it's really important that your microbiome is up to speed with its efficiency, which means
Yeah.
you've got to look after your microbiome, if I'm
Yeah.
understanding it correctly. So this is not just a nice to know, oh, I must get healthy. It's one of those biohacks that I must do. This is actually essential for functionality of
Yes.
the immune system.
Yes, basic functionality. Without it, the immune system ceases to function. Keep in mind that the immune system is born naive. It has capability, but it's naive. It is knowledge
It has to be
naive, right?
trained.
Yeah, and the reason for that, and it makes perfect sense because the immune system is one of those systems in your body that has to be able to adapt to your environment, and your environment is constantly changing, right?
Changing.
You're a worldly person. You travel a lot, I'm sure.
Hmm.
You know, if you go to visit South Africa and then you go to Europe and then you come to the US all within a few months, those are very different environments, very different
Exactly.
triggers, right? Very different antigens, things that could potentially make you ill. And your immune system has to adapt to all those different environments. And so it cannot be born with a set of rules of what's good and what's bad. And so it uses the microbiome, which is the most adaptable component of your system, to decide for it what is good and what is bad,
That's amazing.
right? And so, yeah. And so we know, like data, for example, if you had a course of antibiotics, it dramatically increases your risk for a viral infection, right? And your response to a viral infection gets dramatically attenuated or compromised because your microbiome's dysfunctional, right? We
Mm,
know even in cases like cancer. So there's immunotherapy, right?
yeah.
Can be a very effective way of treating certain cancers,
Hmm.
where it's basically upregulating your own immune cells, particularly your T cells, to find the tumors and get rid of them. And they do
Yeah.
so amazingly. But in those individuals, there's been a bunch of studies showing that when they have a messed up microbiome and then you do the immunotherapy, it doesn't work. If
Oh,
you improve their microbiome, right? If you improve
okay.
diversity, if you improve some of the keystone species, then the immunotherapy works really well. And again, it's because the microbiome is dependent, your immune system is dependent on your microbiome. Now, this is also true for your neurological system. right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why you take IBS, right? As a
Yeah.
very, very common
Common.
digestive issue.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the cohort of people, adults with IBS, if
Mm-hmm.
you have IBS, upwards of 70% of people with anxiety, confirmed anxiety and or depression also have IBS. Compare
Yeah.
that to people who don't have IBS, which is around 19% of people who don't have IBS have anxiety. It's almost upwards of 70% of people with IBS do have anxiety. So if you have IBS, you have almost a
Wow.
fourfold increased risk of anxiety, right? Because it goes hand in hand. The gut dysfunction that most people think is normal or quote unquote common, the bloating, the indigestion, the food intolerances, the chronic constipation or chronic diarrhea. We think of those as like, common things. And often people learn to just live with them, or
Yeah.
they say, well, I just can't eat these 15 foods and I feel okay. All of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But what it's actually showing is with that dysfunction in the gut, which we're feeling as bloating, indigestion, chronic constipation, and so on, has profound effect because your neurological system is dependent on your microbiome, right? Your response to stress and how your body comes down from stress is heavily dependent on the health of your microbiome. And so yeah, we really can't overstate that these are not just hacks, they're not just, optimizing health. These are foundational to our function.
Yeah, I love what you've just explained. Honestly, this is, I thought I knew about the microbiome until you started talking, but it's because you've given the other angle, and it's a very accessible angle. And that is that this 55 trillion community that lives inside of us is giving our body the instructions and training our physical body, because our brain and body don't think. They simply follow instructions and then
Yep.
they learn and wire it in. So our mind is doing that on a psychological level and a neurological and a biological level, but it's working hand in hand with the gut. So it's almost like it's mind, microbiome, and then biology, the
Yep.
actual neurology and biology or neurophysiology, which is extremely interesting if you look at the external support and help that we need. And you also point out such an important thing about the IBS and the bloating and that kind of thing, how people just learn to live with it.
Hmm.
How that is just so important that we recognize that you don't have to just learn to live with it. That it's not a that that it's what I was trying to say is that our biology, our nervous system works through our biology. So our mind lives through the nervous system, even though the mind is the bigger part. But if your nervous system is playing up, which means that your microbiome is not what it should be, that
Hmm.
our biology, which is the smaller part of us, becomes the 100%. So we get
Hmm.
consumed by the reactions in our body. And then that feeds back into the mind. Hence, the feeling of unmanaged anxiety, hence the feeling of unmanaged depression, because depression and anxiety aren't illnesses, they are responses, but they
Yep.
can get out of control. And if they get out of control, then they feed back into the body, and now the microbiome gets even more affected. So if we can understand that there's a mind component and a mind decision to take a biological decision, which is sort out the microbiome, we're starting to deal with this thing in a very constructive way.
Yeah.
It's manageable. You're taking something that feels, oh, I've just got to live with this, into the realm of, oh, actually, there's a logical thing going on here. There's a
Hmm.
logical pathway to and solution, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
You're empowering people,
Yeah.
essentially.
It's very exciting because so much of how people feel and the issues that they're dealing with on a regular basis can be attributed to an ecological issue in their system. And you can always change the ecology, right? Because the
Yeah.
ecology dictates how your body responds to things. You could take two individuals, or for example, identical twins, right? So there's a whole bunch of studies on what we call discordant twins, right? So these are
Hmm.
identical, meaning they have exactly the same genetics, and yet one twin is really obese and the other twin
Yeah.
is lean, right? And they study their microbiomes, and they show that the twin that's obese has a different microbiome than the twin that's lean. So despite their exact genetics and their exact
So
household
interesting.
that they grew up in, right? Anytime this person, the obese twin, eats, they harvest more calories. They have worse blood sugar control. They have a satiety issue, meaning they end up eating more because their gut brain isn't talking effectively,
Hmm.
versus the lean twin that has better satiety signaling, has better insulin response and insulin and blood sugar control, upregulates fat burning better. has more natural GLP-1 agonists that come from production of short chain fatty acids. And so all of these things are microbial ecosystem derived differences that completely changes that individual's outcome, right? Remember, they are genetically identical,
Identical.
right?
Hmm.
Identical, 100% identical. And yet one twin struggles with weight, and no matter what they eat, they seem to gain weight. The other twin can eat whatever they want and have no weight gain issues. Their phenotype, or the way their biology expresses, is completely driven by their microbiome, right? And another great example of the connection between mind, body, biology, and biome
Hmm.
is if we take a relatively common infection. It's called Campylobacter jejuni. It
Hmm.
is typically a foodborne pathogen that comes from contaminated chicken, or sometimes lettuce and things like that, right? One of the strategies of this microbe, right? So when microbes enter into your gut and they want to compete, they want more space, they want more real estate, right? So they're trying to compete with the neighboring microbes. So they induce certain tactics to get diarrhea to happen. The reason they want diarrhea to happen is they want more sloughing off of the mucosal layer where your good commensal bacteria are attached, right? So the more diarrhea you have, the more of the good bacteria are being flushed out. That gives them more space. So this
Mm.
microbe has figured out a way to create diarrhea. It produces a neurotransmitter that goes up the vagus nerve, which is a bidirectional highway that directly connects the gut to the brain, and causes panic attacks in people. So now anything you're perceiving outside, so visual things or auditory things that you see or you hear, induce a panic response. The panic response is the brain's response to the biological entity.
Yeah.
And then as a result of that, the panic is causing loose bowels and diarrhea, right? So then that's back to the to the cell and the biological function. So you've got biology affecting neurology, neurology affecting the brain and the perception of the world around you and your realities and all that. That perception causes a return biological response, which causes diarrhea. All of that because this bacteria wants more real estate, right? So
Wow.
it's really fascinating when you think about the power of single microbes and their ability to hijack and or take over components of our system that can have a profound effect on us, right? So now that individual that's suffering from the Campylobacter infection is dealing with panic attacks all the time,
Mm.
right? And they may not have any clue that it has anything to do with a single bacteria sitting in their gut.
That's crazy. I mean, we're talking about a serious a situation that's epigenetic. It's
Hmm.
the environment. The environment is so your biology responds, and this is something we talk about a lot on this show, is that your environment that you're in, the experiences you have, the the food choices you make, but predominantly your mind, because your mind is leading the food choices. It's leading how you manage that reaction, how you understand the reactions in your body. So this, for example, this conversation now is giving you knowledge which is an epigenetic factor that can help guide you to look after your microbiome. So we're
Hmm.
talking about environment, we're talking about epigenetics, we're talking about something that we actually can direct with our mind because our mind is not the brain. The brain and
Right.
body are just, you literally are stressing with this example what my audience is used to hearing, which is the brain and the body simply do what the mind tells it to do.
Hmm.
So the mind is going to work with the biome, and the biome is then going to instruct the brain and the body. But if our mind is a mess, the biome's a mess, the brain and the body are a mess and vice versa. So that epigenetic facts and environment are just so important. You talked about that. I can't even say that bacteria you
Yeah.
mentioned.
Campylobacter. Uh-huh.
Campylobacter. What about C. diff, which I know
Hmm.
is that the same sort of thing or similar pathway? Because that's something that people get told that, well, you've just got to have these incredibly strong antibiotics. I was told I had this, and they wanted to give me these antibiotics that I didn't even want to take because the side effects were horrific. And they
Right.
said you can live with this forever, and the antibiotics basically just dampen it. There was no discussion, however, with my specialists that, hey, let's put you on a probiotic or
Hmm.
let's deal with your microbiome. It was all just you have this and it's never going to go away. And the only way to control it is through these extremely strong antibiotics that have terrible side effects. And chose not to do that. And I chose to go the probiotic route. What is your take on something like that? Is it a similar kind of process to the other
Yeah, so I mean, it's a similar goal for the pathogen,
Yeah.
right? So
Okay.
and
Similar
C.
goal
diff
for
is a as I said, they try to induce diarrhea because they're trying to clear out the real estate so they have more room. C. diff does it in a different way. So C. diff, what it does is it produces two toxins that creates massive amounts of inflammation in your large bowel. That inflammation negates water absorption, which then really loosens up the stool, right? So you're supposed to absorb most of your water in the large bowel, which then solidifies the stool so that the stool comes out as a solid mass. When your large bowel is heavily inflamed, in the case of Crohn's, colitis, for example, or C. diff infection, what tends to happen is you don't absorb the water, so then the stool becomes very liquidy and it comes out as diarrhea. C. diff becomes even worse because it's a pathogen like many other pathogens requires iron for function, right? So what it does is it eats away at the lining of your gut, trying to get to the blood flow so that it
Mm.
has access to more iron. And as a result, the diarrhea becomes bloody. So the classic symptom of C. diff is frequent bloody diarrhea.
Mm.
But again, it's one microbe that's completely changing all how your biology works, your choices, how you feel, all of that stuff, as a result of going after its goal, which is to have more real estate, right? And so we have to understand these little variables and
So
factors within the biome, right? That leads to really significant issues for us, as the human. But it's really the bacteria just trying to achieve its little goal.
wow.
And I like what you say a lot about the mind because um the great evidence of that. So as a researcher, as somebody that
Mm.
has done lots and lots of clinical trials, I've designed and run and been part of over 50, 60 clinical trials.
Wow.
And one of the things that we always have to factor in a clinical trial is the placebo effect, right?
Yeah.
The placebo effect is incredibly powerful, which I
Mm.
think is a wonderful thing. Like people will say, oh, that's just a placebo effect that it worked.
Meanwhile,
Great.
it's more important than the. Yeah.
Exactly, right? I'm like, fantastic. If we could heal ourselves just based on our belief, that's
Yeah.
an amazing thing, right? And we absolutely can. On
Yeah.
every clinical trial, we do so much to try to work against the placebo effect. So we know that the effect of the
It's
testing
from the.
compound
Yeah.
is real
Hmm.
because the mind is so powerful at creating change in the body, including at the molecular level. When we look at molecular markers, when we look at disease pathology, we look at physiological changes and all that. It's so powerful that we have to work so hard to undo that effect by randomization and double blinding and all these things that we have to do, right? So you're absolutely right. And then there's also really good evidence that the mind impacts the microbiome, and then the microbiome impacts
The
the
mind.
body and the brain, right?
Hmm.
So there is a connection there. So your
Definitely.
perceptions of things, your identity, your view on the world, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic or simple things like
Yeah.
that, your ability to visualize the self that you want to be, your ability to deal with crisis, which brain waves you function in,
Hmm.
all of those things can alter the microbiome. And then the altered microbiome affects your biology, which either reinforces a negative mind or will reinforce the positive mindset, right?
Mm.
So your biology and your microbiome is there as a player in this, and it becomes really important to fix that microbiome because you want it to be working with you and for you, not against you.
Mm, that's fantastic. I love how you just explained that. It's so brilliant. And that really that the mind is actually because it's quite true that everything is in the mind first and then it puts
Hmm.
that energy wave into the brain and the body and then the brain and the body respond. But whatever your thought is or what your experience or your response is affects the as it goes into the brain, it's affecting the microbiome. And the microbiome is basically the interim sort of thing that is then affecting the brain and the body response because the brain and body
Yep.
just respond. That is brilliant. Thank you for explaining it like that. I think that is so important. Now, I know that everyone's listening and saying, okay, so what do we do? But before we dive into the what do we do, what fascinates me is that our pets battle with this as well. Can you
Hmm.
talk a little bit about the gut brain axis and our pets?
Yeah, absolutely. So The gut-brain axis in general is referring to the both the physiological and neurological connections between the gut and the brain, and how the gut is really thought of as a second brain. As you mentioned
Yeah.
earlier, it has more nerve endings than the spinal cord. It's called
Mhm.
the enteric nervous system. So
Nervous
that's the
system. Okay.
neurological system covering the digestive tract. And of course, the microbes have full access to that neurological
Hmm.
system, which is directly connected to the brain in a bidirectional highway. So a lot of what happens in our brain, in terms of our perceptions, our mood, and the health of our brain, all of that is heavily affected by the gut. And we see that in our animals as well, because our animals, our pets, are subjugated to the same issues that drive health concerns in us, right? Because they're living in
Hmm.
our environment.
Hmm.
So just like humans, eating highly processed, unhealthy foods, which impacts our microbiome, causing things like leaky gut and driving chronic low-grade inflammation and causing gut-brain issues, which then increases our risk for anxiety, depression, and all
Hmm.
that. Our pets go through the same thing because they're eating heavily
Yeah.
processed foods, right? All the kibble stuff and the dried foods, and this very low nutritive quality in them. It
Hmm.
doesn't provide them and sustain their microbiomes the way nature had intended. That gives them significant dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of microbes, leaky
Hmm.
gut. We actually did one of the first studies and published it on leaky gut in pets. And we showed that
Wow.
it's very profound and it exists in companion dogs. And then that can create all kinds of anxiety and behavioral issues, massive risk for things like dermatitis. Atopic dermatitis is one of the most common conditions in household pets, which is an allergy and all that in their skin.
Yeah.
And of course, they suffer many of the same human chronic illnesses that their wild cousins don't. If you
Hmm.
take dogs, for example, and the closest genetic cousin to a dog, a wild animal, is a gray wolf.
Hmm.
Dogs suffer from hip dysplasia, diabetes, a myriad of cancers, allergies, heart disease, both congenital and lifestyle related heart disease. Gray wolves don't suffer from any of those things. Pancreatitis is
Hmm.
so common in our household pets, which is really affected by the health of their microbiome. And so, because they
Wow.
are eating all the processed foods, they're around all the chemicals we put in our
Yeah.
environment. Imagine we're walking our dogs down our streets. They're sniffing in the grass. The grass is full of pesticides and herbicides and all kinds of synthetic fertilizers, right? They're getting all of that in their system and are becoming really dysbiotic. So we had actually developed a probiotic for leaky gut, immune support, gut brain support for pets,
That's
because I'm a
amazing.
big dog lover, right?
Oh,
And
me too.
pets
Yeah.
do, yeah, and pets do amazing things for us, right? So studies
Exactly.
show that households that have pets have people that have lower frequency of anxiety, depression, chronic illnesses. Households that have dogs have kids with much lower incidence rate of allergies, asthma, immune dysfunctions. In 2020, a study came out that if you brought a pet into your household, it increased your longevity and your health span, right? So they're doing incredible things for us,
Yeah.
but in the same time, we are turning around and making them sick.
Oh no.
Right. So, short of trying to clean up our environment and improving the things that we're exposed to, we wanted to create a supplement that could help them,
I'm so happy about
the
that.
way supplements help us. Right.
I'm so happy about that. I'm going to be putting my dogs on that supplement. And on that note, please can you tell us about what we should be doing and using? I mean, I personally, okay, talk about let's talk about how people can deal with this issue and what we
Yes.
can give ourselves and our dogs and our
Yep.
pets.
So a few foundational things. I have kind of a 5 pillar system. And I'll give a general view on what each of the pillars are. Pillar number 5 is supplements, right? So there
Okay.
are other things that people really need to be focusing on before they start including supplements, which
Yeah.
is an important pillar. But just keep in mind that supplements on their own are not necessarily going to solve the
Fix the problem.
problem.
Hmm.
Yeah, we have to do other things as well,
Okay.
right? They can be a very powerful part of our protocol, but I want people to be very aware of other things that they have to add in. And then we'll talk
Exactly.
about specifically what kind of supplements I use and I recommend. So number one is diet, right?
Hmm.
Diet has probably one of the biggest influences on our microbiome from the human side and
Hmm.
the pet side. Reduce that processed food as much as you can, right? The ultra processed
Yeah.
foods. all the labels and all that, and go towards whole foods. What I feed my dogs, for example, because it's a little more complicated with going whole foods with dogs, is I used to prepare the food for them, a little bit of organic rice, and then sometimes some certain types of beans that they do well with, and then just meat, and I
Yeah.
don't flavor the meat. I don't use any oils or anything like that. I just cook the meat in the skillet and mix it in and give it to them. Now there's a high pressure pasteurized kind of a raw food mix that is kind of meat and vegetables and all that, that I use. It comes frozen in individual packets, portioned for them based on their size and all that. I use that. So we stopped
Mhm.
using all the kibbles and all that stuff a
Oh,
long
yeah.
time ago, right?
Me too. Long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a big help for them. Number two, and then on the human side, whole foods, polyphenols, as
Mhm.
diverse as you can with your diet, as many different foods as you can, and then fiber, right? We cannot
Mhm.
overstate the importance of fiber, right? 40, 50 grams per day. You want to build up to that. If you're
Mhm.
eating 4 or 5 grams of fiber today, you don't want to go to 40 tomorrow. You want to add in 2 to 3 grams a week until you work your way up to 40 or 50. There's so many large scale studies that show the massive impact of fiber consumption. So
So important.
for every gram of fiber you add to your diet, right? Sorry, every 10 grams of fiber you add to your
Mhm.
daily diet, you reduce your all-cause mortality risk by 10%, right? And that's
Wow.
up to around 45 grams of fiber. So imagine you're sitting
Okay.
there today and you're concerned about all these chronic conditions.
Mhm.
If you got to 45 grams of fiber per day, you can reduce your risk of all-cause mortality, that is dying from anything,
Wow.
by
That's amazing.
45%,
That's
right? That's
crazy.
massive.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So
amazing.
that for
Got it.
column one is food.
45.
Column two,
45% or it says 45% reduce of all cause mortality.
45% reduce all-cause mortality by adding 45 grams of fiber
45
per
grams,
day.
45%. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio.
One
Okay.
to one
Terrific.
ratio. Yeah. And
Amazing.
and I
Amazing.
with fiber, I do half natural food and half supplement because I want to
Okay.
really dial in and make sure I'm getting enough fiber. So I use psyllium husk, for example. And the best way for me to consume it, because I'm also concerned about metabolic health and insulin
Mhm.
resistance and all of that stuff. So before every meal, about 30 minutes before every meal, I take about 5 to 8 grams of psyllium husk, which is a mix of soluble, insoluble fiber. It does a number of things. So if I'm eating 2 or 3 meals a day, that already gets me to almost 20 grams of fiber. And then the rest I get through, food,
Through food. Yeah.
through food, right? And the other thing it does is what it does is it slows down your gastric emptying. So it makes you feel full much
Mhm.
sooner. So you eat less. It blunts the insulin response after the meal
Mhm.
very dramatically by almost 60, 70% in my case. I've used a CGM, a continuous
Yeah.
glucose monitor, and tested. If I took fiber with this meal versus no fiber with this meal, the glucose response on that meal is blunted by like 50% for me.
Wow.
So it's really, really powerful. And then it's your natural GLP-1, right? So it improves your metabolic response to the food, and then fiber diversifies your microbiome, and it really gives your good commensal bacteria all the food it needs, right? So diet is the first pillar. The second pillar is exposure. Exposure.
Mhm.
It's about getting more and more exposure to natural environments with natural bacteria. So going out on hikes in the natural environment, sitting on the beach, going for walks, in forest preserves and in natural areas, and then touching things. I always
Mhm.
encourage people: you go on a walk, touch leaves and branches and sticks, and pick things up and hold them, right? And then
Mhm.
sit down in the natural environment and eat something. That's one of the most natural ways of engaging with the environment. That's what our ancestors did. And studies show that people who have more time in natural environments, or rural people, for example, have much more healthy microbiomes, much more diverse than people in urban areas, right?
Mhm.
Because we're not getting exposed to these natural
Yeah,
microbes
the
that
natural things.
improves. Yeah. Number three are lifestyle components. So these are sleep and exercise, right? So sleep is critical because our microbiome is a diurnal system, which means it works off a 24-hour clock like our normal bodies, meaning that in the nighttime when you're getting rest, different
Mhm.
types of microbes come to fruition. and they turn on all these housekeeping genes
Mm-hmm.
to repair your cells and your neurological system and reduce inflammation and build muscle and all of these amazing things, but they don't get active unless you're sleeping adequately. They even produce something, talking about brain health, something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor,
Mm-hmm.
BDNF,
BDNF. Mm-hmm.
right? Which is so critical for repairing the central nervous system and the brain from all the damage that could have occurred during the day,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that sleep period is really important. Exercise is really important because it reduces stress, it reduces cortisol, it improves metabolic health. But here's another little tidbit on exercise that people don't really realize, especially with weightlifting and resistance training. When you lift weights when you resist, and your muscles are lifting weight against a resistance, when you contract your muscles release a set of chemicals called myokines. These myokines actually seal up the lining of your gut, modulate your immune response, increase the diversity of your microbiome, and to do all kinds of amazing things for your gut brain axis, and so on. This is why for people who are anxious and stressed, if you go and you lift some weights, do
Mm-hmm.
some squats, do a wall sit, do some burpees, right?
Mm-hmm.
You feel much better
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. The anxiety and the stress comes down. It's not just because you're burning off the nervous energy, it's because of the release of these myokines that calms the
As you
system down.
relax. So as you resist, the myokines get released. Okay.
They do. Yep. And so,
Okay.
so that lifestyle component is pillar number 3, sleep, exercise, right? And then the fourth one is your environment. You don't want to be in an over sterilized environment. Most of your surfaces in your home don't need to be sterilized. We have this programming that clean means that chlorine, fake lemon scented smell, right? Where we're
Mm-hmm.
sterilizing every surface. We really don't want that. What we really want is we want a natural environment that has a microbiome within your home, for example, right? We basically only sterilize like our toilet and the shower. Most surfaces in my house, we don't clean with a chemical solution. We use water with a little bit of essential oil for smell and wipe it down, right? If you bring a raw chicken on your counter and you get raw chicken juice, by all means sterilize that. But
Mm-hmm.
other than that, you really don't need to be sterilizing every counter. We also have doors and windows open as much as possible so that we've got the natural environment coming in, we've got microbes coming in. You need to create an ecosystem in your home. You don't want to be constantly in a very sterile environment, right?
Excellent.
That helps a lot. And then the final thing is supplements. So that's pillar number 5. The foundations to me from a supplement perspective are a probiotic. The most effective probiotic for general microbiome balance, for leaky gut, for diversity, for battling against pathogens are spore-based probiotics,
Okay.
right? And my favorite that I've done research with is the Just Thrive probiotic and antioxidant. It's a
Okay.
spore-based probiotic, 3 billion CFUs per day, one capsule per day. You take it with food, and it provides a lot of protection to your gut microbiome. The other thing that goes along with that is something called a psychobiotic. These are very specific probiotic strains. In this case, it's called Bifidobacterium longum 1714. This strain has been shown to modulate the gut-brain communication and dramatically reduce stress and anxiety and cortisol response, right? So it reduces that overactive gut-brain communication and the production of neurotransmitters and inflammatory cytokines that keep triggering the brain to upregulate cortisol
Okay.
response,
Very
right? So that is really great for just managing mood and getting your mind in the right situation
Mm-hmm.
or in the right order. And then digestive bitters,
Mm-hmm.
right? So most people, I mean, we call them common gut conditions because they're so prevalent. So these are things like bloating, indigestion, reflux, chronic constipation and all that. Most of those conditions can be alleviated by upregulating the activation of bitter taste receptors in the digestive tract, right? So bitter taste receptors are basically these receptors that we have evolved to bind bitter compounds. When our ancestors ate food, they almost always had bitter compounds in their food, right? Because they were foragers. They ate seeds and nuts and leaves and things like that. All of those things contain bitter compounds. And those bitter compounds help your digestive system signal that food is coming through where the food is to upregulate all the digestive processes, right? So these are things like increasing stomach acid production, increasing bile production, increasing stomach or digestive enzyme production and release, improving bowel movement so that the food actually moves through the bowel properly, improving the bile acid pool in the liver, encouraging the gallbladder to release the bile, right? All of these really important digestive signals come from binding bitter receptors, and we have no bitters in our food anymore, right?
Wow.
We've basically removed the bitter taste out of our
Mm-hmm.
food.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think back of like traditional diets and all that, people always had bitters in one way or the other, right? Whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
drink, a shot, or they would
Yeah.
eat a salad first. This is why eating salad first makes a lot of sense, because a salad contains the bitters that starts the
Mm-hmm.
digestive process. And so about 50% of the digestive signaling just to process food comes from binding bitter taste receptors. And so if you're not binding the bitter receptors, you're missing half the signals to digest
Wow.
the food, right? No wonder we feel all of this indigestion, bloating,
That's amazing. Half
constipation,
the
and all that,
signals.
right?
You
Yeah,
lose half the signals, which is crazy. Yeah, no,
which
that's
is crazy.
yeah.
And that's just how we exist, right? We're missing half the signals of basic digestive functions. So when it comes to supplementation, I like the Just Thrive probiotic,
Mm-hmm.
the daily digestive bitters. Just Thrive has
Mm-hmm.
an amazing 12 bitter formula, which is a very complex bitters.
Mm-hmm.
I use that with every meal. And then the psychobiotic, which is just helps with mood and calm throughout
Mm-hmm.
the day. And then finally, if we were to add and then the Just Pets for the pets. And then finally, if we were to add another one to really enhance the diversity of the microbiome, the prebiotic, because a prebiotic contains oligosaccharides, which are types of fibers that specifically feed beneficial bacteria, right? So that's that combination with the other pillars that I talked about will make a profound change to your microbiome and your overall health and wellness.
Oh, Kiran, this has been absolutely incredible. You've explained what people hear a lot about, but get very confused about because there's just so
Mhm.
much information out there. I think this is an incredibly good summary, something that people can re-listen to this and again and again because there's such great advice. So it's basically diet exposure. The third one was
Lifestyle, so the sleep and
lifestyle. Okay.
exercise.
So the third one is lifestyle,
Mhm.
and then environment, and then supplements. And then with supplements,
Yes.
you're recommending the Thrive supplements, the probiotic, the psychobiotic, the digestive bitters for all those fantastic reasons. I mean, half the signals that just help you digest your food and stop the IBS, etc.,
Okay.
are going to come from the bitters. There's the dog one, for pets as well, which is amazing. And then you mentioned one more, which the
The
prebiotic. Okay,
prebiotic,
the
yeah.
prebiotic, which is amazing. Well, this is incredible. Thank you so much for the wisdom. I mean, this was just so, I enjoyed every moment of it. And I know that there's actually something that Thrive is offering. Just Thrive is offering a 20% off. If people go to
Amazing.
justthrivehealth.com/Dr. Leaf in caps, you can actually get 20% off these supplements. I try and follow those 5 pillars as much as possible. I teach on those as well. I love them, but you explained it so beautifully. And I love the Thrive products. I've used all different kinds, but this Thrive, I felt the difference. Kiran, I was actually quite surprised because
Mhm.
I test a lot of different ones out, but I was quite surprised at how quickly I felt the change from using the Thrive, the prebiotic, the probiotic, and the bitters, the digestive bitters. There is a difference. It really
Yes.
has helped me. So I hope it will help people. And well, thank you for your time and your advice and your input. This has been so interesting.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll talk again.